Previously on Balls.
Anyway, Ross, welcome. Nice to have you on the show.
Thanks, man.
We're calling you the anti-Oscar or what? Are you gonna go heavy on our boy again now or what?
What do you mean again? He went anti-Oscar on himself the other day.
No, but come on, yeah, he acknowledged that his timing was wrong. But we spoke to Tim yesterday, who's 2 offices above you, I think, and he said Oscar's got a point.
Did he?
Yeah.
Okay. How's that?
He says the longer blades on the other athletes does give them an advantage insofar as they have obviously get longer strides. So it's kind of Usain Bolt theory, where longer strides are given an advantage. And I mean, come on, that comeback in the final straight. Gee.
Well, yeah. So the comeback in the final straight is about half a second. The first 100 for Pistorius was 11.1, whereas Oliveira was 11.5, and then the second half was half a second the other way, which is not all that unusual. If you watch some of even the Olympic able-bodied races, you see the same thing. It's just unusual to see it when the guy leading loses that much time to the guy coming second. That was perhaps unusual.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't argue that that's necessarily proof of anything. The question about stride length is interesting because what it shows, and it's true, that if you increase stride length without changing anything else, then you will run faster.
Yeah.
The difficult thing is, and if I go back to the basics, is that in a double amputee, you don't know how tall that athlete should have been, because they've obviously lost a segment of their limb, depending on where the amputation is. It's either a small or a long segment. So what the International Paralympic Committee have done is they've looked at thousands of measurements on other people, and you look at things like their arm span, the length of shoulder to hand, the length of the knee to the hip, and they've used formulas based on that stats to try and determine what the maximum allowable height needs to be for an athlete. So in other words, if you saw a guy who was 6 foot tall or 180 and half of him was legs and half of him was upper, you'd look out of proportion, and that's kind of the concept that they're using. So they issued I don't know whether it was leaked or it was deliberately pushed out into the media, but of the athletes in that race, Pistorius is allowed to be 193, and the Brazilian athlete Oliveira is allowed to be 184.5. Both of them are under those limits. Interestingly, Pistorius is further under his limit than the Brazilian athlete. Pistorius runs at 184, whereas the guy from Brazil runs at 181. So they're a little bit different in terms of how much they still have to go before they sort of cross that ceiling, if that makes any sense. Turns out that what Oliveira has done is in the last month he's lengthened those blades. Now it's very difficult to argue that he's done anything wrong because he's not exceeded that ceiling. He still, in theory, has this much to go with if he wants to get up to that ceiling.
But it's not proportionate now, though.
Sorry?
It's not proportionate to his body height, though, surely.
No,
doesn't matter.
But it is, because that's what that 184.5 means. It means that based on thousands of measurements that they've taken of other people, if he exceeded 184.5, then he would suddenly look out of proportion or be out of proportion based on what we know about human segment lengths. Same thing for Pistorius. He could go up to 193 before he looked out of proportion. That's what that concept means. But you're right, it's such a difficult thing to try and put to a formula, because when you look at these athletes, they do look out of proportion, and he did. But then so does Pistorius, because they've got much longer limb segments below the knee because of the carbon fiber blade that they're running. The bigger question, though, is that no one in that race was illegal. The bigger question is if technology can make this much of a difference to performance, if you make a small change, and all he added was this much, and he says he's gained a second. And his argument will be that all he has done is he's put back in what nature left out. And he'll say that this is where I should have been, and all I've done is I've increased my blades to that point. Now the thing is, well, prove him wrong. How can you? And that's the problem with the technology. That was the issue with it, why it was, I think, such a slippery slope in the first place. Is because there's no way to argue against his claim, which will be, this is where I should have been, all I've done is gone up to there. Now the question is, well, show him that he shouldn't be, and you can't.
Yeah. All right. I'm trying to adapt this now to able-bodied athletes. We use this. I asked him this question yesterday, where I say, it's like Usain Bolt against Johan Blake. Johan Blake is much shorter than Usain Bolt. I think his legs are a lot shorter as well.
Yeah.
So there's different principles that are needed for them to be able to run certain times and for one to beat the other. But Usain Bolt has a bigger stride, and they say that's where he has the advantage, especially coming down the final straight, as we saw in his race.
Yeah.
Now, if we have to listen to adapt this, and I know you shouldn't, but as we're saying, who has an advantage here? An able-bodied athlete, that is physiologically how they are made up. That is how Usain Bolt was born, how he's been conditioned, how he's grown up, and that's what he looks like. When you start using artificial assistants like blades, the question was, do you then prescribe one size fits all in that scenario?
Well,
would that make it fair, or would that make it unfair? That's the question.
It would make it fairer from the perspective of the people who are watching it, but it would make it less fair for the person who is using it, if that makes any sense.
Which person, the shorter person or the taller person?
Well, the person who would be most disadvantaged by that would be the taller person, because he would be given... Let me use this analogy. If you gave every cyclist in the Tour de France the same size bicycle, some guys will be riding things that look like BMXs, and others will look like they're riding on penny farthings. And the only guy who's happy is the guy who's perfectly average. And so the problem is you allow the guy to choose what suits his body shape and type. And that's the problem here. So if you had a very tall athlete, like let's say Usain Bolt, if you gave him a standardized set of carbon fiber blades, he would be running on really short little legs relative to his body. Whereas if you took someone like Tyson Gay or Johan Blake, who's shorter, their legs would now be disproportionately long for their height. So the problem is, and the best way maybe for your listeners or viewers to conceptualize is, if you want to be a good swimmer, what you need is a really long upper body and really short legs. If you want to be a really good runner, you need really long legs, short upper body. And in fact, there's evidence on that to show that athletes from Jamaica and Kenya have got disproportionately or relatively longer legs than their upper bodies are compared to European athletes, for example. So that's one of the problems. And when you're dealing with elite athletes, you can't necessarily apply those formulas. And that's why Oliveira will say, hey, I know that I'm only 177, but now I've made myself 181. All I've done is given myself the little boost that I would have had I had legs. And you can't argue against that. And that's why the point that you make about if we have these artificial technological aids, suddenly it skews the question, because how do we know where the improvement came from? And if you apply that same logic to Pistorius, the beauty with Oliveira in terms of the debate is that he has made a change, and you've seen its impact on performance. Pistorius hasn't made a change, but he could have made that change 3-4 years ago. And so we're still seeing, in his case, potentially an artificial performance, which is the consequence of technology, not physiology or training. And that, for me, is a problem. And what happens in 4 years' time when there are 5 athletes who are running under 21 seconds? Because this could well happen. Now, it seems that the floodgates are opened as a consequence of guys like Pistorius who have really been pioneers. What then? Because now you'll have a guy running 20.5 seconds, potentially even winning able-bodied races. And you say, well, is it because he's got legs that are a little bit long, or is it because he's a naturally good athlete? And until you can answer that question, I can't see how you can allow the technology into the sport.
So, but I mean, it's not like Oscar can suddenly, for his next 2 events, change, and we could say he has got leeway, he's got room to maneuver, but because it's a feel thing as well, surely. I mean, he must be so used to running on blades that size. If he suddenly decides to add whatever he can to get close to his limit, so that he could also, as he claims, get the advantage that Oliveira got, he would probably fail dismally because he's not used to blades of that size. Would I be right there?
Yeah, he would. And the 2 interesting things come off that statement where you're quite correct is, number one, he's got 9 centimeters to play with, because the IPC, which is the body that controls Paralympic sport, they allow 193 centimeters, and he's at 184. So he's got 9 centimeters that he could still add for those events. He can't add them for athletics, IOC or IAAF events, because the ruling that allowed him to compete against able-bodied runners stipulated that he must use the blades that were tested. And so 4 years ago, when he was first cleared to compete, he was running on blades that made his height 184. Now, the second point that I would make is, ask this question is, why is he running at 184 when he could have gone to 193? We know why today, because he can't go higher for those events. But 4 years ago, think about the answer to that is, why did he not choose to be at 193? And the answer is because it would affect his start, it would affect how he runs around the bend, It would affect how long it takes him to get up to top speed. And so there's a lot more to the performance than just the stride length. And that's the point that I wanted to make. And that's where I would actually disagree with Tim Noakes on this one, is that you can't just add length to the guy's legs and expect him to get faster. And I strongly suspect that Pistorius would have undergone quite substantial testing to determine what his optimal length was, and that's how they decided that he should run at 184. If he added centimeters, I suspect he'd slow down.
Yeah, it would affect him. I'm just going to kill our camera. Don't worry, you're still there. Just because your picture's frozen for a while, so it might just be because we're also sending picture to you. So don't panic. We are still there. Simon, you had a question?
Yeah, but Ross has kind of answered it. I wanted to ask about why doesn't Oscar simply lengthen his blades
longer?
But what then is the way forward here?
Well, just to add to what Simon was bringing up, there's why didn't he lengthen those blades? And you talk about this testing, because I know that Oscar goes to Iceland where they manufacture the blades quite often. And when you start talking about an athlete testing the equipment to find the optimal balance and the optimal, this sounds to me a lot like Formula One, and that sits uneasily with me. The way forward then is to not allow this to become technological warfare, which is unfortunately where it will become, what it would become, sorry. So they would have to try now to standardize the specifications of those blades. But appreciate how difficult that is, because in this discussion, we're talking about one aspect, length. But you could also change the material used, you can change the stiffness, you can change the curvature of that blade at the back, you could change the way it's attached, you could change the mass. So there's so many different things that would have to be controlled for by the federation. But that's where they will have to take this debate. As far as I'm concerned, in the Paralympic type competitions, there needn't be a debate, because as long as there's a formula that sets a limit, then you can allow it to happen. In the same way that wheelchair athletes don't all use the same wheelchair. And yes, people will argue that some are better than others, but that's how it is. The problem for me comes when you start talking about the crossover of Paralympic into Olympic Games. And allowing athletes like this, Oliveira and Pistorius, to compete against able-bodied runners. And again, I don't want to dig up 4 years worth of debate again, but I think this illustrates more than ever how slippery the slope is when you start introducing technology, because you never know whether you're seeing a performance that is a function of technological advancement and innovation as opposed to physiology. I think this should be the catalyst to reopen that debate. Whereas for IPC events, you just have to say, hey, there's a ceiling. As long as you're under it, race as fast as you can.
Well, Oscar's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't now, because he obviously has to race. Now, if he goes into the next race in a similar scenario and wins it, it blows his argument out the water then.
Well, yeah.
So, I mean, it's almost like he goes into the next race going, well, if I'm going to push this argument further, I mustn't win.
Well, yeah, and the funny thing about that is, of course, had he run in the final the same time that he'd run the night before, he would have won this race too, because he was actually faster than Oliveira's winning time. But he's in a very difficult, it's really a catch-22, because as I see it, he's got two things to do. He can either come out and say, yes, I was beaten by a better athlete, or he can come out and say, the technology made the difference and that's why I lost. And if he does that, he almost invalidates or discredits everything he said in the last 4 years about, hey, the technology doesn't give an advantage. And of course, now you've added the third one, is if he goes out and wins, despite the advantage that he's claimed the other athlete has, then people will say, well, if he has it, then so do you. So he's in a difficult situation, but again, like slippery slope, welcome to the to the slide.
Yeah. All right, Ross. Well, once again, interesting debate. And as I said, it kind of started when the debate went about how a Paralympian could have an advantage over an able-bodied athlete. I mean, I never thought we'd ever get to the point where, that would be a topic of discussion. But there it is. Thanks.
I will say that I'm 100% certain that within our lifetime, I hope, we will see the Paralympic competitions for these events being won in faster times than the able-bodied Olympics, because better athletes, better technology, better training, better use of the technology, and more people coming to it. Because Pistorius, especially, but also Oliveira, people will look at this and say, I want in, other double amputees, and the pool of athletes will get bigger, the quality will improve, and the times that we see in Paralympic Games will pretty soon be faster than the Olympic Games. And that will, for me, that'll be the full stop at the end of the argument. That Usain Bolt would not be able to compete with double amputees within this generation.
Hey, listen, I was watching BBC last night, and there was a program about someone who'd never been able to walk. They were a quadriplegic, and they were showing them walking in the suit.
Oh yeah,
Literally. I mean, who says it's not going to go there one day?
it could well, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why again, there needs to be some sort of line, and it's arbitrary and it's harsh, and you say, hey, it's not his fault that he wasn't born without legs, but you could make the same argument. Say it's not my fault I wasn't born 6'8" tall with Usain Bolt's muscle fibers. So it's just a very tricky debate, and the introduction of technology for me skews it and blurs the line, and it's just too difficult to debate to have without throwing curveballs like we saw Sunday night in London.
Thanks for chatting to us, Ross. Always very
interesting.
interesting. We appreciate you joining us on Skype this afternoon.
Thank you, Ross.
Well, thanks, sir.
Cheers, man. Bye-bye. There we go. Ross Tucker saying it's on a slippery slope.
Yeah, interesting, lovely stuff.
Interesting insights. In addition to what we said, chatted with Tim Noakes yesterday about, coming from Ross Tucker this afternoon here on Bulls Radio.
2 p.m. to 6 p.m. Mondays to Fridays live on balls.co.za. Balls.co.za.